The ballroom of the Lycan capital had never felt so suffocating. Jade Emerson pressed herself into the velvet shadows of the mezzanine, her fingers trembling against the cold marble railing as she watched the Moonlit Gala swirl below. Thousands of crystal LEDs pulsed like dying stars, casting a clinical, neon glow across the faces of high society alphas and power-hungry socialites who had gathered from every territory to witness this betrayal. The bonding. She should have crossed the silver veil into the human world hours ago. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to return to her quiet apartment and protect the tiny, flickering life growing inside her. For 3 days, she had waited for Killian to call, to text, to give her any reason to stay. But the man who had tattooed his promises onto her soul had sent only silence. At the center of the floor stood Alpha King Killian Night. Even from the heights of the balcony, Jade could feel the raw, predatory heat radiating from him. His tuxedo jacket strained against his broad shoulders, unable to hide the runic tattoos that crawled up his neck like black vines. He looked every bit the bad boy king, lethal, untouchable, and rigid. As he reached for Bianca Rossi's hand, the sheer power of his presence forced every wolf in the room to bow their heads in submission. Jade realized then that the man she loved was gone, replaced by a king who was about to trade his heart for a crown. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall. It wept, a relentless gray curtain that mirrored the cold wall Jade had built around her heart. 3 months had passed since the night of the Moonlit Gala, and the glittering skyscrapers of the Lycan capital now felt like a fever dream from a life that belonged to someone else. Here, in a cramped studio apartment above a laundromat, Jade Emerson was a ghost, a nameless human woman blending into the damp, neon-soaked pavement. She had taken a job at a small, cluttered bookstore on the corner of 4th, spending her days shelving paperbacks and breathing in the scent of old paper instead of the pine and musk of a wolf pack. It was a mundane existence, exactly what she needed to stay hidden from the Reaper units she knew were scouring the borders. But her body was beginning to betray her sanctuary. As she reached up to slide a heavy hardcover into place, a sudden, sharp heat flared in the center of her palms. She pulled back, gasping as a faint, ethereal glow, like the shimmering dust of a supernova, pulsed beneath her skin before vanishing. It wasn't the golden light of a standard Lycan. It was something colder, more ancient. Her morning sickness was no longer a mere inconvenience. It was a rhythmic thrumming in her veins that seemed to sync with the phases of the moon. On the nights of the crescent, she felt a terrifying surge of energy that made the light bulbs in her apartment flicker and die. The child she carried was not just a hybrid. It was something the world hadn't seen in generations. The Starwolf lineage, once a myth whispered by her grandmother, was waking up inside her, fueled by the king's royal blood. One evening, as she walked home through the downpour, she caught her reflection in a shop window. For a fleeting second, her eyes didn't look brown. They were a piercing, luminous silver, swirling with the same cosmic energy that had once defined the Night Court's legends. She quickly pulled her hood lower, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was becoming a beacon in the dark, a lighthouse for the very man she was trying to escape. Every time her abdomen fluttered with the baby's movement, a phantom ache resonated in her soul, the severed bond crying out for Killian. She knew the peace of the human world was an illusion. The rain could wash away her tracks, but it couldn't drown the celestial fire burning in her womb, a fire that would eventually lead the Alpha King straight to her door. The air in the obsidian throne room of the Night Court was thick with the copper scent of blood and the ozone of a storm about to break. It had been 90 days since the light had gone out of Killian Knight's world, and in that time, the bad boy king had transformed into a monster of singular, terrifying focus. The once glittering ballroom was now a jagged war room, its marble floors covered in topographical maps of the mortal and supernatural realms, stained by the rings of whiskey glasses and the muddy boots of scouts who had returned with nothing but excuses. Killian stood over the central table, his knuckles white as he leaned his weight against the wood. His tuxedo had long since been replaced by tactical black gear, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the runic tattoos that now pulsed with a rhythmic, angry violet light. His eyes, once a piercing hazel, were now a constant, predatory gold, the mark of a wolf that had forced its human counterpart into the passenger seat. "Explain to me." Killian's voice dropped to a low, guttural vibration that made the glass chandeliers overhead rattle in their frames. How a single woman with no pack, no scent trail, and no assistance manages to vanish from the most fortified city in this hemisphere. Sire, a senior advisor stammered, his neck bared in an instinctive plea for mercy. The silver veil is vast. If she crossed into the human side, the static of their technology masks. In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, Killian was across the room. He didn't shift, but his claws had elongated, digging into the throat of the advisor's tunic as he slammed the man against a stone pillar. The sound of stone cracking echoed like a gunshot. I don't pay you for theories on human static, Killian hissed, his breath hot against the man's terrified face. I gave you her name. I gave you her blood signature. If you do not find a trace of my star by the next moonrise, I will stop executing your scouts and start with the council. My mother's political games have already cost me my soul. I will not let her incompetence cost me my mate. He flung the man aside and turned back to the maps, his gaze burning a hole through the geography of the human world. To the rest of the realm, he was a king gone mad, a tyrant tearing apart the foundations of their society for a common girl. But Killian could feel the hollow ache in his chest, a physical, gnawing hunger where the bond should have been. It wasn't just madness, it was a countdown. He could feel her getting stronger, her energy beginning to ripple through the ether like a beacon. He would find her, even if he had to burn every city in the realm to ash to see her face again. The bell above the bookstore door chimed, a lonely sound that usually signaled a local seeking shelter from the Seattle drizzle. But as the door swung shut, the air in the cramped shop changed instantly. The scent of rain was replaced by something sharp and familiar: ozone and old cedar. Jade froze, her hand hovering over a stack of paperbacks, as a shadow loomed at the end of the aisle. Jax. Miller looked wildly out of place in a human hoodie, his broad shoulders practically brushing the bookshelves. His face was etched with a weariness that made him look a decade older than he had at the gala. Before Jade could bolt for the back exit, he held up his hands, palms open in a gesture of peace. Jade, don't. I'm not here to take you back, Jax whispered, his voice raspy. I'm here because if I don't find a way to fix this, there won't be a kingdom left to go back to. Jade's heart hammered against her ribs, her protective instincts flaring as she unconsciously moved her hand to cover her stomach. How did you find me? I'm the king's beta, Jade. I know your scent better than my own, he said, stepping into the dim light of the aisle. He looked at her hand, his eyes widening as he caught the subtle, celestial shimmer beneath her skin, the sign of her awakening legacy. Gods, you're glowing. If Killian sees you like this, he'll never let you go. But you need to know the truth about why he let you go in the first place. Jade felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. He didn't let me go, Jax. He chose Bianca. I saw the ring. He was drugged, Jade, Jax countered, his voice urgent. Sloane didn't just use politics, she used a distilled lunar toxin. It didn't just cloud his mind, it severed his connection to his wolf. He was a passenger in his own body, a puppet forced to play a role while his soul was screaming. Since the day you vanished and the toxin wore off, he's been a ghost of a man. He hasn't slept. He hasn't eaten. He's burning through the treasury and the loyalty of the great houses to find you. Jax stepped closer, his expression grim. The realm is on the verge of a bloody civil war. The other alphas see his obsession as a weakness, and Sloane is moving in the shadows to replace him with a puppet. Killian isn't just hunting you because he's a bad boy who lost his toy Jade. He's hunting you because without his star, he's tearing the world apart just to find enough light to breathe. Jade leaned against the shelf, the weight of the revelation making her dizzy. The betrayal she had nurtured like a wound was suddenly transformed into a tragedy. She thought of the flickering lights in her apartment and the power growing in her womb. She wasn't just a runaway anymore. She was the only anchor for a king who was currently drowning the world in his grief. The sanctuary of the bookstore felt smaller now, the shadows between the shelves lengthening as if the darkness itself were leaning in to listen. While Jax stood in the aisle, the weight of his revelation hung in the air, but far across the silver veil, in the cold, white marble heart of the night court, a different kind of storm was brewing. Sloane Knight stood in her private solar, her eyes fixed on a scrying glass that shimmered with a sickly, iridescent oil. She had felt it, a ripple in the cosmic fabric, a pulse of star energy that shouldn't exist. It wasn't just the girl. It was the life force growing inside her, a heartbeat that sang with the unmistakable cadence of the royal bloodline. A hybrid heir. A bastard with the power to unify the fractured houses and strip Sloane of the regency she had worked decades to secure. Sloane didn't scream or rage. She simply let her fingers trail over the surface of the glass, freezing the image of a rainy Seattle street. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she summoned the air behind her to thicken. From the corners of the room, 3 figures bled out of the architecture, the Reaper units. They were the Night Court's most kept secret, assassins whose souls had been hollowed out and replaced with shadow magic. They didn't breathe, they didn't bleed, and they never failed a hunt. "The girl is in the human city they call Seattle," Sloane whispered, her voice like the sliding of a blade against silk. "She carries a parasite that would see this kingdom fall to ruin. I want the girl silenced, but the child must never draw its first breath. Erase them both. Leave nothing but ash and the scent of rain." The Reapers bowed, their forms flickering like glitching shadows before they dissolved into the floor. Back in the bookstore, Jade felt a sudden, violent chill sweep through the room. The hair on her arms stood up, and the starlight beneath her skin flared a warning, agonizingly bright. Outside, the Seattle rain seemed to turn black as it hit the pavement. The mundane world was no longer a shield. Sloane's reach was long, and her shadows were already stretching across the veil, hungry and cold. Jax smelled it a second later, the scent of ozone turning to the rot of dead stars. He reached for the silver dagger hidden beneath his hoodie, his gaze darting to the windows. The hunt had shifted from a king's desperate search to a queen's silent execution, and the Reapers were already standing in the mist across the street, watching for the glow of the Starwolf. The damp concrete of the alleyway behind the bookstore felt like a tomb as Jade and Jax retreated into the shadows. The transition from the human world to the supernatural hunt was instantaneous. The streetlights above groaned and shattered, raining glass like jagged diamonds onto the wet pavement. From the swirling fog, the 3 Reaper units emerged, their forms less like men and more like tears in the fabric of reality. They moved with a sickening, liquid grace, their blades forged from solidified shadow, humming with a frequency that made Jade's teeth ache. Jax shoved Jade behind him, his silver dagger catching the faint light from a distant storefront. "Run, Jade! Get to the main road," he roared, but as he lunged forward, the lead Reaper flicked a hand, and a wave of kinetic darkness sent the beta flying into a stack of industrial crates. The wood splintered, and Jax slumped to the ground, pinned by a shroud of oppressive energy. Jade backed away, her heels catching on a discarded pallet. She was cornered, the brick walls of the dead-end alley rising up like the bars of a cage. The Reapers didn't speak, they drifted toward her in eerie unison, the center assassin raising a blade aimed directly at her womb. A cold, primal terror seized her, but as the tip of the shadow blade grazed her coat, something shifted deep within her marrow. It wasn't the heat of a wolf's rage, it was the absolute, vacuum-cold power of the cosmos. Her heartbeat, usually frantic, suddenly slowed into a deep, resonant thrum that shook the very air. Protect the air. The dormant Starwolf lineage, suppressed for generations, didn't just wake, it detonated. Jade's eyes flew open, the brown irises replaced by burning, white-hot novas. A scream tore from her throat, but it sounded like the collision of planets. From her chest, a shockwave of blinding, celestial light erupted, turning the midnight alley into a noonday sun. The Reapers, creatures made of pure shadow, shrieked in a discordant, metallic pitch as the holy light disintegrated their forms. The bricks of the alleyway glowed incandescent, and the puddles on the ground evaporated into a shimmering mist of stardust. For a heartbeat, Jade wasn't a fugitive or a waitress. She was a celestial event. The light punched through the Seattle fog, shooting a pillar of silver radiance straight up into the atmosphere, a flare that pierced the silver veil and signaled to every supernatural creature within 1,000 miles that the star had returned. When the light finally ebbed, the Reapers were nothing but scorched marks on the pavement. Jade fell to her knees, gasping, her skin still humming with a soft, bioluminescent glow. She looked down at her hands, where frost and starlight still danced between her fingers, and realized that she could no longer hide. The king would have seen that light. And he was coming. The sky over the Pacific Northwest didn't just darken, it bruised, turning a violent shade of indigo that shouldn't exist in a human city. Back within the borders of the Lycan realm, the air had turned to fire the moment Jade's power detonated. Killian Night had been standing on the balcony of his war room, his wolf pacing in the cage of his ribs, when the pulse hit. It wasn't a scent or a sound, it was a cosmic tether snapping taut, nearly dragging him to his knees. The hollow void in his chest where his mate belonged suddenly filled with a white-hot radiance that burned through the last of his restraint. "Find the breach," he had roared, his voice more beast than man. But he didn't wait for his scouts. Killian tore through the silver veil like it was wet parchment. He didn't use the hidden paths or the sanctioned gates. He used the raw, jagged force of a king's grief to puncture the reality between worlds. Where he crossed into the human outskirts, the earth cracked, and the ancient trees of the borderlands splintered into kindling. He moved across the human landscape like a shadow-wrapped comet, a black-clad titan of destruction. Every Lycan enforcer he encountered who tried to delay him, those loyal to his mother, or those simply too slow to move, was cast aside with a violence that left the highways scarred and the air smelling of scorched iron. He was a blur of runic tattoos and golden-eyed fury, his motorcycle abandoned miles back as his wolf demanded a more primal speed. Every step he took toward Seattle felt like he was walking through a furnace. He could see it now, the fading pillar of silver light that had pierced the clouds. It was her. It was his star. As he neared the city, the modern electronics of the human world began to fail in his wake. Transformers exploded, raining sparks like falling stars, and car alarms wailed in a discordant chorus that announced the arrival of a predator they couldn't understand. Killian didn't care about the exposure or the laws of the veil. He had spent months in a drug-induced purgatory, watching the world through a glass wall while his mother tried to sell his soul. Now, the wall was gone. He could feel Jade's heartbeat, rapid, terrified, and pulsing with a second, smaller rhythm that made his predatory instincts go absolutely feral. The Alpha King wasn't just coming for his mate anymore. He was coming for his blood, and he would burn every bridge between the realms to make sure he never had to breathe the air of a world that didn't contain her again. He turned the corner into the alleyway, his boots crunching on the glass of the Reaper's remains, his silhouette a dark, jagged omen against the receding silver glow. The silence following the celestial blast was more deafening than the explosion itself. Jade stood amidst the rising steam of the alleyway, her chest heaving, the silver light still receding into her pores like cooling embers. Then, the air at the mouth of the alley didn't just move, it shattered. Killian stepped through the veil of mist, a vision of absolute, jagged ruin. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and found it lacking. His tactical gear was shredded, his runic tattoos glowing a dangerous, overheated violet, and his eyes, the eyes that had haunted her dreams, were wide with a mixture of predatory relief and agonizing soul-deep pain. "Jade," he choked out, the name sounding like a plea and a command all at once. "Don't come any closer," she snapped, her voice trembling, but her hand already sparking with defensive starlight. The rage she had buried under months of Seattle rain surged to the surface. "Go back to your throne, Killian. Go back to Bianca. I'm just a nobody servant, remember? I'm the girl you didn't even have the decency to say goodbye to before you took another woman's hand." Killian flinched as if she had struck him with a physical blade. He moved with a speed that defied her warning, pinning her against the scorched brick wall. He didn't touch her with violence. He touched her with a desperation that was terrifying, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones as if checking to see if she were made of smoke. "I was a prisoner in my own mind, Jade. My mother, the lunar toxin. I was screaming for you behind a wall of glass I couldn't break. I have burned half the realm to find you. I have lived in a nightmare every second you were gone." "You expect me to believe that?" she sobbed, the first hot tears finally breaking through. "You broke me in front of everyone. You left me with nothing." "I left you with everything," he growled, his forehead dropping against hers. His wolf suddenly went still, his golden eyes dropping from her face to the soft curve of her midsection. The air between them hummed. Killian's hand drifted downward, trembling uncontrollably, until his palm pressed against the fabric of her coat. Underneath, the baby kicked, a strong, rhythmic pulse that resonated with the king's own royal heartbeat. Killian froze. The breath left his lungs in a ragged gasp as he felt the undeniable, celestial thrum of his own bloodline. The bad boy king, the man who had faced down armies without blinking, crumbled. He fell to his knees before her, his face pressing against her stomach as a broken, guttural sob escaped him. A child, he whispered against her skin, his voice thick with awe and a new, lethal protectiveness. "My star. You're carrying my heir." Jade looked down at the dark crown of his head, her fingers instinctively twitching toward his hair. The rage was still there, but it was being drowned by the sheer, overwhelming gravity of his presence. They were no longer just two lovers torn apart. They were the architects of a dynasty, and the world was already coming to destroy what they had built. The atmosphere within the night court had curdled into something stagnant and foul. While the Alpha King was miles away, hunting ghosts in the human rain, his mother moved through the throne room with the silent precision of a spider weaving a shroud. Sloane Knight stood before the Great Council, her face a mask of practiced, tragic grief that belied the cold ambition in her eyes. Beside her, Bianca Rossi played the role of the abandoned bride to perfection, her eyes downcast and her hands clasped in front of her white silk gown, looking every bit the victim of a madman's whims. "He has abandoned us," Sloane's voice rang through the vaulted hall, amplified by the heavy silence of the gathered nobles. "Our king has crossed the silver veil not for diplomacy, but for a delusion. He tears at the foundations of our laws, hunting a common girl while our borders crumble and the other houses sharpen their blades." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink into the uneasy hearts of the Alpha Lords. "Killian is no longer the protector we need." The lunar toxin did more than cloud his judgment, it broke his spirit. "He is unfit for the crown." The murmur of dissent was weak, quickly silenced by the presence of Sloane's loyalist enforcers standing at every exit. Bianca stepped forward, her voice sweet and poisonous. "I was to be his lunar mate, a union to secure our future. Instead, he chose to chase a phantom into the mud of the mortal world. For the safety of the realm, the regency must be established." Behind the heavy velvet curtains, the transition of power was already signed in blood and shadow. Sloane had spent years preparing for this moment, using Killian's bad boy reputation and recent erratic behavior to paint him as a tyrant unhinged by a fractured bond. She didn't just want the throne, she wanted to erase the very memory of the girl who had nearly ruined her plans. As the council began to nod in reluctant agreement, Sloane felt the surge of victory. They would declare Killian in exile. They would strip him of his titles and hunt him down as a rogue wolf. By the time he realized the trap had closed, Bianca would be the face of the new order, and the Starwolf lineage would be nothing more than a footnote in a history written by the victors. The Night Court was no longer Killian's kingdom, it was a fortress of his mother's making, and the gates were locking behind him. The sky over the Lycan capital did not break, it burned. The silver veil groaned as it was forced open once more, but this time, it wasn't a desperate man who stepped through, it was a god of shadow and a goddess of starlight. Killian Night walked down the center of the great hall, his every footfall cracking the marble floors. Beside him, Jade Emerson was no longer the soft-spoken girl who had vanished into the rain. She wore the shimmering essence of the Starwolf like a second skin, her eyes glowing with a silver intensity that made even the highest-ranking alphas drop to their knees in instinctive terror. The coronation of Sloane and Bianca came to a violent, screeching halt. The council members, who had moments ago been swearing fealty to a usurper, scrambled back as Killian's roar shook the foundations of the palace. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical wave of dominance that stripped the breath from their lungs. "The king is dead, long live the queen?" Killian's voice was a low, lethal purr as he ascended the dais, his claws extending. "You were always so impatient, mother." Sloane stood her ground, her face pale as she stared at Jade. "You are in exile, Killian. You brought a human filth and her bastard into our sacred." She never finished the sentence. Jade stepped forward, and with a flick of her wrist, a burst of celestial light bound Sloane in place, the power so pure it acted as a truth serum to the soul. "The only filth in this room is the woman who would poison her own son to steal a crown," Jade said, her voice echoing with the resonance of the Ancient Ones. "And as for my child, he is the true heir of the night, and he will not be born into a den of vipers." Killian moved with the grace of a storm, his hand seizing the royal crest from the wall and crushing it into dust. In a swift, brutal purge, the loyalists who had facilitated the coup were dragged into the light by Jax and the warriors who had seen the stars return. Bianca was stripped of her titles, her ambitious cries falling on deaf ears as she was led to the dungeons. Killian turned to Jade, the bad boy king finally bowing his head before the woman who had saved his soul. He took her hand, pressing a kiss to her glowing knuckles before turning to the trembling council. From this day forth, the Night Court is no longer a kingdom of secrets and poison. It is the seat of the star and the shadow. As they sat upon the throne together, the fractured bond finally snapped back into place, whole and unbreakable. The realm was no longer being hunted, it was finally being led by its true king and his eternal queen.